Okay, everyone, I'm glad you're back. Yesterday we had talked about the atonement. Actually, I was giving an introduction to um, the atonement, what the atonement is, and I said that we were going to have a series on what the atonement is all about. Okay, so we're only going to be a few minutes, maybe 3 minutes. But first, I'm so pleased that you came back to look at this short video on the atonement. Um, one, when you read the book of Hebrews in chapter 9 and chapter 10, and also in the book of Psalms chapter 40, you read about Jesus, or you read about the atonement. Let's just put it that way. You read about the death of Christ, the sacrifice that Christ made for you and for myself. Normally, when you hear the word atonement, most people don't, or a lot of people don't really know what it is. But the atonement only means the sacrifice of God. It means the death of Christ through a sacrifice, put it that way. The death of Christ through a sacrifice, or through him giving up his life, dying on the cross for the sins of all of us. So that is called the atonement. When Jesus gave up his life as a sacrifice for the sins of you and me. That's called the atonement. Okay. Now we can go on and on and on about other areas of the atonement, but this is very basic, and along with it being basic is something I think that we really don't grasp what this entails, what the atonement entails. He's also called the Paschal Lamb, the Paschal Lamb. He's the Paschal Lamb. Or when you think about the Paschal Lamb, you think about the Passover. Okay, so Jesus, his death was a sacrifice to God. Also, at the Last Supper, Jesus was celebrating the Passover. And it's amazing how he selected and picked the Passover as the time that he will give himself up or deliver himself up to die or death. It's just amazing when you read the Old Testament and you think about how burnt offerings was done in the book of Leviticus, and you think about the forgiveness or the removal of sins or the covering of sins, and that they needed, the priests needed a sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, and then to cover them. That's grace. And then when you look at what Jesus did in the New Testament at Passover, he even provoked certain events that led up to his death. Jesus knew that that the Passover was here. He chose the last meal. He chose that particular day to to use as a day or the week before his death, the few days before his death. He chose that time. What time? The time of the Passover. It wasn't that he was shying away from it. He knew exactly what he was doing. Why? Because he was the sacrifice. There's a there's a link between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and Jesus was just following some things of the Old Testament, trying to help the people in his day and in his time to remember the culture and the traditions and the sacrifices that they were using. And one of the strong, one of the sacrifices that was used, or traditions that was used for us in covering his people for the ignorance of sins, was sacrificing an animal to cover for their sins. So Jesus became that sacrifice. He gave up his life for you, and he gave up his life for me. He even said at the time of leading up to his death, he said, "This is the new covenant." When he sat down with his 12 apostles, he said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." Remembering, or getting them to remember. He said this in remembrance about the Mosaic covenant, the covenant of the Mosaic covenant, I guess you can say it like that, in the book of Leviticus. So Jesus saw his death as a sacrifice, or a sacrificial offering to God. It wasn't something that his life was just taken. It wasn't by accident. He knew exactly what he was doing. He used his life as a sacrifice. For what? That's why. To offer himself up to God. No one took it. He gave his life up for you and for me. Well, I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope just in a short video, you learn something about the atonement. So we'll see you next week. God bless you, and we'll hear more about the atonement. God bless.